folks who are here. I guess to start, for those who don't know me, my name is Rich Joseph, and I had the privilege of hosting these what we call community conversations through the Center for Community Wellness at Sportsman Tennis Center in Dorchester, and tried. These conversations started during COVID. Really, we've had a lot of conversations around COVID and the vaccine and other issues that are pertinent to the immediate community right around Sportsman's, obviously, in the larger Blue Hill corridor, and like to have these conversations be town hall style in many ways. So like to have people chat questions to me as we go through the discussion. I obviously have, I'll steer us through the discussion, but I would love most of the questions to come honestly from the people who've joined, so that they can get their questions asked and addressed, because we are very fortunate to have two awesome guests with us tonight, who come at weight management and obesity and sort of from a lot of the same perspective, but different angles in certain ways. And so Dr. Cody Stanford is here from MGH and has become a close friend of mine, and has been doing this work for a long time, obviously a pioneer in the field of obesity medicine in many ways, and thinks specifically around issues around weight bias and how we talk about weight in the clinic setting, and especially how we address obesity and weight management for communities of color specifically. And then Chioma Tomlinson is a PA from the primary care world at the Brigham, who focuses a lot of her clinical practice on weight management specifically because she has a background in exercise science and spent time in the fitness world beforehand. And so we've obviously bonded about that in many ways. And so I think it'd be really interesting to have both of them, because obviously Dr. Cody Stanford's clinic is a bit more focused, like definitely focused on weight management specifically. And then Chioma has sort of the primary care perspective on things as well. And so I also do weight management medicine. So I might chime in a little bit because I do have, pretty, I have views on this stuff as well. So I'll facilitate obviously, but also we'll chime into the conversation. And so I thought where we could start is actually understanding a bit of the biology of weight gain, and how we think about obesity in the weight management world, and maybe why that's different than how we talk about it even in the primary care setting. I mean, definitely in sort of popular culture and what you see in magazines and things like that, and sort of how we talk about weight as a society. But obesity, and I'll let Dr. Cody Stanford talk maybe a little bit about obesity and how we think about it from the weight management perspective and why that's different and why it's important for people to get that and understand it. Both people who are here and clinicians, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. First of all, thanks for you all for being here. I think it's important for us to recognize the complexity of obesity as a disease. Many people think it's just simple. You just stop eating, you exercise more, and then we solve weight management issues. The problem is that it's so much more complex than that. And I think it's our simplification of weight regulation that's led to this really constant increase in weight across our nation, across the world, because of our lack or poor understanding of the disease itself. So the most important organ, actually, when we're looking at weight and weight regulation is the brain. And a lot of people don't realize that actually it's not just about willpower. It's actually how the brain decides to signal to either store fat, or cause you to eat more or things of that sort. And so when we're thinking about why people have this disease of obesity, it's important to remember that it can be some of their genetics. It can be some behavior, it can be environment, it can be different influences as we talk about, or we are now allowed, I feel like, to speak about issues such as racism, structural, systemic racism and its impact. We think about the stress associated with racism and how stress leads to storage of more fat. So it's important to recognize that it's indeed very, very complex. I make sure that all of my patients know that, this idea of you reporting how many calories you're taking or whatever that is, doesn't mean anything to me because, when you look at it, it's really about, if we're looking at the food part of it, It's about, processed of how processed one's diet is. We want our food to look like it looks in nature. So things like the chewy lemon heads that I was craving earlier today don't really look like anything in nature, right? They do taste yummy, but they don't look like anything in nature. And so it's about the processing of the food. With my patients, I actually never have them ever report calories. I have them report the quality of their diet. But it's more about diet. It's about diet. It's about physical activity. It's about sleep. It's about stress. It's about thermogenesis, which is how our body burns at rest and with activity. And we could keep going on and on. So you can see that it's indeed a complex equation. And that equation differs from person to person. And so when I'm working with individual patients, my goal is to help them get to the happiest, healthiest weight for them. And unless they're an identical twin, I'm not expecting to compare them to anyone else but themselves. And so I think that that's important for us to think about it. I'll end with kind of this thing. We think about BMI or body mass index, which you may have heard, and which is based upon the Metropolitan Life Insurance tables, which did not really include a diverse population. So for example, I actually went and redrew the BMI chart back in 2019 and published it in the Mayo Clinic Journal. And what we saw actually when we did that was that for Black women, for example, which is the group known to have the highest rates of obesity, actually shifted the BMI curve up. So a person with obesity is a person that is known to have a body mass index of 30 or higher. But for Black women, and when we look at the current history and the current data that we have in terms of looking at something called NHANES, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, for women, Black women, it actually goes up to somewhere between 31 to 33. So I don't really use that number as the end all be all. It takes into account height and weight, but doesn't take into account fat or body composition, lean muscle. It just does this a calculation and it assumes that we're all the same. So I like for me to be thoughtful about not just what the number is on the scale, not just what the BMI is, but where one's fat or adipose tissue, that's the fancy word we use for it, where it's being carried. When it's being stored in the midsection, that's where we don't like it. And when it's being stored in the hip, buttock, and thigh region, it's okay. It's not around any vital organs. So I'm thinking about the complex nature of the disease, about all of the things that can actually lead to worsening of diseases related to obesity,
I think I
in
think
addition
it,
to obesity itself.
well, I think it's interesting that you call it a disease, right? Because I don't know if many people have heard obesity referred to perhaps as a disease. And so, I mean, even Chioma, like in the primary care world, I know that you obviously think about this differently, but are your colleagues calling obesity a disease?
It's starting to change, which is a good thing, but it definitely, for a lot of folks, it is considered kind of a lifestyle issue. And it's interesting because diabetes is a lifestyle disease as well, but we don't shame people about their diabetes. Hypertension is a lifestyle disease as well, and we don't shame people about their hypertension. But for some reason, when it comes to obesity, it's a moral failing. And I think that that's part of what prevents folks from treating it like a disease and allowing it to have comprehensive treatment strategies.
Totally. And so, back to Dr. Cody Stanford, like when you
I
talk
used to say
about,
doctor. I don't go by Cody Stanford. I go by Dr. Stanford.
okay, Dr. Stanford or Fatima.
Fatima.
Fatima, we'll do Fatima. We're all
Yeah.
on a first name basis here.
Yes.
So I guess it's been more recent that we've called obesity a disease, right? That we've recognized
Actually, I
it.
can tell you exactly when we really started doing it. So
And tell
in
me, tell like
2013.
the definition too of like what classifies it as a
Yeah, I
disease.
wish I could pull up some slides, you guys. I'm used to with every patient. I got some slides. I got slides ready. But let's go with this. First of all, when we look at when we really started to see the uptick of obesity as a disease, it was 2013 when the American Medical Association House of Delegates. So for you guys that are listening, the AMA is a representative body of physicians from all subspecialties and states and territories throughout the United States. There is no discipline of medicine that is not represented in the body. It's about 270,000 physicians. And in 2013, they flew me in to speak to the House of Delegates before they did their pivotal vote as to whether to acknowledge obesity as a disease. It was interesting because one of their own internal councils actually had wanted to not acknowledge obesity as a disease. So they flew me in to kind of change the minds of everyone. And 88% of the House of Delegates did vote to acknowledge obesity for the disease that it is. In current terms, in terms of when we look at the definition, so the definition here in the United States, which is based on the guidelines that are put forth by the CDC, which is based on the World Health Organization, which we're now a part of again, looks at body mass index. So a person is considered to have normal weight status if their BMI is between 18.5 and 24.9. A person is considered to have overweight if their BMI is between 25 and 29.9. And then we get into these classes of obesity: class 1, class 2, class 3 obesity, or what we consider to be mild, moderate, and severe obesity. A mild obesity, class 1, is BMI of 30 to 34.9. Class 2 or moderate obesity, BMI of 35 to 39.9. And then those that have severe obesity, a BMI of greater than or equal to 40. So that is the current definition. Now, if you go to Canada, where they just recently changed their guidelines, they look at weight, but they tie into more of the metabolic health, where weight's distributed, and look a bit more at that, and a little bit less of a focus on just the sheer number that the BMI tells us. So that gives us some information about how different areas are classifying obesity.
Totally. And I think that, you already alluded to the fact that it is a multifactorial issue, right? This is not just a matter of like, oh, I ate too much for too long. It's actually like there's, neurobehavioral elements to this where, appetite signals get dysregulated and hormones get all screwed up and things like
Absolutely.
that. And I think I think it's a double-edged sword to classify people's nose with a disease, right? Because then that does sort of put a label to something. But at the same time, if you don't recognize it as a disease, it makes it more of like, oh, this is on you to fix, and this is like totally your fault, right? And like I think that's the tension a little bit, that I see a little sometimes, and I wonder how, maybe Chioma, like how do you talk to patients about that in your clinic? Like if you say, I'm going to put in, in your chart, we're going to put in the diagnosis, or like on your problem list, we're going to put obesity as a disease for you. How do patients respond to that?
It's a good question. And so, one, I'm very mindful of the way I talk to patients. And so I use patient first language. And so I don't say that they're fat, and I don't use morbid obesity. We don't classify any other terminal condition with the word morbid. Even cancers aren't described as morbid. So I don't use that term, but I do explain to folks that it's chronic, it's progressive, and it's relapsing. And the reason why we put it on their chart is because it is a modifiable risk factor. So just when folks have a A1C, if you will, the hemoglobin A1C, once it reaches 7, I don't not put diabetes on their problem list, because I know that that's something that we always have to think about, and we always have to make sure that we're treating, because if we don't treat it, it's going to get worse. And so I look at obesity as a disease, and I look at it the same way, that this is a chronic condition that we always have to make space for. And as long as we're able to do so mindfully and with care and compassion, the conversations for me, they tend to go really well.
And I guess, are there any dangers, do you think? I mean, do either of you see any drawbacks or concerns with medicalizing it too much? I'm curious.
No, absolutely not. I think
Yeah,
that
go for it.
for a long time, we have not acknowledged it for the disease that it is. And with us not acknowledging for the disease that it is, it doesn't get the time, the attention, the research, the research dollars to investigate therapies, how therapies are different within different populations, for example. For example, if you look at Congress, there is a diabetes caucus in Congress, which means a lot of attention, time, energy go into treating patients that have diabetes, which I think is extremely important. But it's important for us to recognize that the most prevalent chronic disease here in the United States and around the world is obesity. And if we could treat the obesity itself, maybe we prevent the patient from developing diabetes. Maybe we prevent them from developing high cholesterol. Maybe we prevent them from developing a host of like 100 plus other diseases. So the reason why I find it gratifying to do the work that I do is because this is really the only profession in medicine where I can actually delete diagnoses if I'm able to get a handle on it. I sometimes run out of diagnoses for my patients because they no longer have any of the issues that they had when they initially saw me. So thankfully, they allow me to bill for history of something that was previous. But if I didn't have that, I would have nothing to bill many of my patients for, because we have been able to conquer the obesity associated diseases. And this is not always, not of course, with every single patient, but for many of my patients, it is quite gratifying for myself and for them to say, you know, I had diabetes. I have a history of diabetes. Ooh, you know, I had sleep apnea in the past. And the list goes on and on. And so I think that the problem when we look at training and education of doctors or PAs or NPs or whomever is caring for patients is that there is minimal education at best regarding obesity. I published a paper in the International Journal of Obesity on just this topic, on how no country does a great job of educating the healthcare providers about obesity disease and how to deliver care for our large percentage of the population that has obesity. Now, you might be like, why is she saying this is the most prevalent disease? Like, is it really that many people? Right now, we know that 42% of US Americans have the disease of obesity. When we're looking at Black women, the demographic that I hail from, we're talking about almost 60% of Black women. So I don't understand how we're ignoring this. It's really a travesty. And I think that it's important for us to recognize it for the disease it is, because it is a disease. There is so much pathophysiology. There's so much work to be done to investigate even further, but we know a lot. And so let's use the knowledge that we have to make it better for our patients.
For sure. Gemma, what was your training like in obesity? I mean, I know that you've come at this from a bit of a different angle on a passion of yours, but like even in your standard PA training, I think it's instructive for people to understand like what did you learn about this, and what have you had to do on your own just to feel like you're equipped to handle this from within your clinic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so there is a group of physician assistants in the American Academy of Physician Assistants that they have recognized that there's a real dearth of information that we get in PA school as far as how to approach this, especially for those in the primary care setting. And so they've actually created a leadership institute, which I'm now a part of, to operationalize how do we start to get folks involved in this care. I've also I joined the American the Obesity Medicine Association, where I first saw Dr. Stanford speak, and I was so inspired. And that moment, that was the moment where I felt I really belonged in medicine. To see a coalition of folks, not just physicians, but surgeons and endocrinologists and psychologists and exercise physiologists. It just, everybody was not only represented within the crowd, everybody was represented on stage. And so it really said that we all have a role to play in this work. Other things through the Obesity Medicine Association, they have a training program for nurse practitioners and PAs where you can get an advanced certificate in obesity medicine. And so I am 18 months into that. And so hopefully I'm going to be able to finish that. And then along with the AAPA program, really be able to provide high quality care. But it is something that you need to be trained to do, just like any other aspect of medicine. And I think that gets lost. So when patients come in, to just be able to say, you know, you just need to move more and eat less is really an injustice. And it's really oversimplifying the work that it takes to help folks lead healthier lives.
Totally. And I think that to your point, so it sounds like, you know, you had to go out on your own. You had to go out on your own a little bit. And I know that we've talked about this, that like you've done some searching to figure out sort of where you feel you fit in, right? Because you have this interest. Same thing for me, and I'm sure same thing for Fatima when she first started. And so I guess one of the challenges too is that there are so many different disciplines that can have an impact here and probably should be or need to be working together. And I think that that's one of the challenges in medicine generally, is that we do have these little fiefdoms and silos. And so sometimes for these large complex issues like obesity, it's not resolved by just like one pill or like one thing or one, you know, it's much more, it requires multidisciplinary care, right? And I think, you know, one of my bigger takeaways for this audience, I think that I look at obesity, I mean, just with the statistics that Fatima just shared in terms of the number of people who are struggling with this disease, and the dearth of resources within medicine to actually support it. Like, it is the biggest mismatch between sort of supply demand in in our healthcare system. And it's on us to figure out how to address that better. And I was wondering, I want to get back. So that was a big point that I just want to share with people, that like, I just think that there's a big supply demand mismatch out there, and these two, Chioma and Fatima, are obviously doing the work that they can do to address it from within their clinic, but like, there's only two of them, right? Like, there's a lot of people who need this help. So I was hoping we could, turning back to obesity it's a disease, and it's also a risk factor for a lot of other conditions. And I was hoping that we could take a little bit of time right now just to understand a little bit about the relationship between obesity and particularly like metabolic health, type 2 diabetes specifically. And then maybe we could talk about a few other things. But I was wondering, maybe, Fatima, you could start us off by just maybe explaining some of the
So
pathophysiology there.
Yeah, it affects every major organ system. So when I gave that talk to the AMA right before they actually voted to acknowledge obesity disease, I talked about this. There is no organ system that isn't affected by someone who has the disease of obesity. So when we're looking at something like going on in the brain, there are neurologic issues that can be happen. For kids, there's something called pseudotumor cerebri, or what we call idiopathic intracranial hypertension. If you're looking at breathing or pulmonary issues, obstructive sleep apnea is a very common one. This means that if you're sleeping at night, you either don't get enough oxygen in, or you have pauses in actual breathing and things of that sort. That's associated with excess weight. For metabolic health, when we get into issues like type 2 diabetes, that is a precursor. Often obesity is a precursor to the pancreas, which is an organ in the body, not being able to produce the amount of insulin needed to regulate one's blood sugar. It causes at least 12 to 15 different types of cancers that we know of right now. We could keep going on. Arthritis, which many people are familiar with. When you carry excess weight, it can lead to arthritis, heart disease, and I mean, the list goes on. I really can't think of very few things that aren't associated with obesity. It's easier to do that list probably than the list of what is. And so that's why I've decided to commit myself to this work. That's why I did a 3-year fellowship in obesity medicine after doing residencies in internal medicine and pediatrics, because I wanted to be able to care for people with the most complex issues regarding their obesity, and be a researcher in this space, so that I can begin to investigate some of the disparities that exist in the prevalence of obesity here in the US and around the world. So I think that's important to note, and it just shows you how vast of an impact obesity has on our bodies.
Huge impact. And I think, I wanted to, Marilyn, I thought, asked a great question in the chat around the extent to which there's agreement sort of in the medical community around how to actually, how best to treat or cure obesity. And is that a challenge that we face sort of within the obesity medicine world to bring it forward and make sure that it receives enough attention that it deserves, like to have more clarity there in terms of like, this is how we
I just
treat
think
it.
we need to teach. I mean, if we're teaching nobody anything, then we can't expect anyone to know anything.
Right.
What do we always tell you? They say, go see your doctor, if you're going to start, go see your doctor. And if your doctor doesn't know anything, how are they going to help you? So I think that first we need to start with educating doctors. Like, if doctors know nothing about the disease of obesity, how do we expect them to treat anything if they know nothing? On day one, we begin to learn about how to treat diabetes. On day one, we also learn how to start treating hypertension. This is a med school, but we never, ever, ever learn how to treat obesity. And indeed, here at Harvard Medical School, there was a curriculum that was geared towards at least some introduction to obesity. That was part of the old curriculum that I taught in. And when they changed the curriculum, they actually removed the required obesity course, which was at the beginning of the second year of medical school. So we went backwards, I would say. We initially required everyone to have this course. It was only 3 days, but 3 days is better than 0 days. And now they're back to 0. If that's what Harvard Medical School is doing, what do we think is going on around the country, or even here in Boston? So I think that we just have to teach people about the disease. And I can tell you the reason why I give the number of lectures I do is because I come in and say the exact same thing I would have said anywhere else, but it seems like it's like glorious because no one's ever heard it because they're hearing it for the first time, which does save me some time in preparing presentations. But I would like to be challenged in some way to have some new thought process coming out. I'm just teaching the basics, you know, the elementary building blocks of obesity as a disease often. And then being surprised that my colleagues at esteemed institutions have no idea anything that I'm talking about.
And Shima, what's been your perspective from the primary care world? And I'm sure, you know, people on this this conversation have perspectives and have, you know, maybe heard different views from their primary care doctors about what, you know, how to think about treating or curing the, you know, even the idea that there could be a possible cure or treatment for obesity. What have you heard from your, even from your own colleagues and from patients who reflect back to you?
Yeah, so I think that there's a real reluctance to talk about it in general, and it there's studies that show that folks that experience weight bias and weight stigma, the first place it usually comes is from the home. And the second most common place is in the healthcare setting. And patients, when they come into the healthcare setting, a lot of times it's a very negative experience. The chairs aren't big enough. They're weighed in, the middle of the hallway. Their weights are called out. It's just kind of 2 points of advice that they're given: kind of eat less, move more. And so a lot of patients leave those appointments discouraged. I would often see those patients on the back end, and they would say things like, "I don't want to see my doctor until I lose weight." And it would just break my heart. Like, no, you have to, well, then come see me and we can talk about it. And so I always leave the door open to have the discussion. I invite it, but I don't force it. I don't tell people your weight's going up, we have to do something about it. I ask them how they feel about it, because not only are there the metabolic effects that most people can call off, and there's the mechanical effects, like things like sleep apnea and hernias and joint disease, the malignant effects that we talked about. There's also a psychological component to obesity care. And it really has to be done carefully and mindfully, and with compassion, because for a lot of folks, there's trauma involved. I mean, growing up, I remember when the pediatrician told my mother right in front of me that I was obese, and it has always been with me. And those messages stay with people, and they really inform how they move forward in life. So I can say that I really wanted to move forward in doing this work, to just be an example that it can be done, be an example that it doesn't have to take a ton of time, be an example to say that it's the only socially acceptable injustice. And if anything, this can be a way of just everyday advocacy and everyday generational healing, is to just open up safe spaces for people to be able to talk about this, gain agency within themselves and within their lives, and then heal themselves from the inside out.
Love it. Love it. I know the three of us are very much vibing about this. You mentioned, I mean, there's disparity in just getting people obesity care in the first place, and having people like the both of you to talk in a compassionate way about how to actually manage this. But then obviously there's disparities even within the care that people receive around obesity, right? Or even just addressing this in the first place, right? And so, obviously, Fatima mentioned the rates of 40%, 42% of Americans having obesity, but of that group, right, I think around 50% are Black and 44% Hispanic, and so there are racial disparities obviously within obesity, and I think many of us know that. But what, maybe just, I'll start with Fatima. I know that you've thought a lot about this, and then
Yeah.
Chioma too. Just what drives, I mean, those disparities? What are the big factors that you think about?
Well, first of all, if we're looking at how we define obesity, in the US, and it's based upon, a BMI chart that's based upon
Right,
like tables
right.
that didn't include people that look like me, you could expect that maybe there's some differences. But I think that, the definition is a bit simple. Like I said, where we carry our fat, that where it's distributed is more important than just the amount that we have. As Black women, we do tend to carry a lot in our hip, buttock, and thigh region. That's usually what we call subcutaneous adipose tissue. So adipose, you keep hearing that organ that is fat. And then there's visceral. Viscera means around the organs. Visceral adipose tissue is what we typically will carry in our midsections. And for men or for women, I think a key thing is that as we go through the life course, especially as we go to hip menopause, we go from having a gynoid distribution of weight. That means we carry our fat in the hip, buttock, and thigh region, to having an android. No, not the phone, but it's a weight distribution. So android is a male-like distribution of weight, which is in our stomach region. And so without doing anything, menopause hits, and then women start noticing that, oh my goodness, I'm carrying weight differently. What's going on? And it's that hormonal change that occurs. But when we're looking at the definitions, it just simplifies it. It doesn't say, oh my goodness, where's that fat distributed? And what we do know, for example, if you're looking at Black boys and girls and Black men and women, since I care for both population, is that we carry more subcutaneous adipose tissue, which is usually not as harmful to our health, than visceral, which is around those organs like the liver and things of that sort. And that's across the life course compared to white men and women. So is it really that we're just so bad, or is it really just that we don't have a great definition, or maybe it's a combination thereof? It's hard to discern with the current status quo. I do think it's a bit of both. And so it complicates the story. And, there have been people that have been trying to delve deep to kind of figure out why some of the disparities exist. For example, there was this large study looking at persons that were born and raised in Africa and comparing them to people of African descent here in the United States, along with comparisons to white individuals and Asian individuals. And they actually found something within our genome, what we call a genome-wide association study, that accounts for almost a 5 BMI point difference that was only found in people of African origin. So maybe there's something like that that's going on. I mean, I think there's so many different things that we're finding out. The thing is that if we don't do the work, we won't continue to find things out, and we won't continue to put together the building block of the complexity of the disease and how to best treat it.
I think your point around, you look into genome studies and things, like I always tell patients that genes do have a big impact on people's weight and the way that they carry their weight. It's your genes aren't destiny, but they do have a big impact. And so I think it's an important thing to acknowledge for people, given how the rest of our society makes obesity seem like it's a willpower issue or something like that. Like genetics have a huge component. How do you think about some of the disparities in just these statistics around the prevalence of obesity?
So as far as just the
Just
rate,
like the disparate, like that how it disproportionately does affect people of color. At least there are higher rates in those areas, and is that and also maybe even touching on, and we can talk to Fatima too about this, just access to obesity care amongst those demographics of people. Is it just that people don't know that people like you two exist, or like what is, what do you think is behind some of that? And I know that you don't have all the answers, but we're just trying to peel back
so
the
so
onion.
I think just as in 2020 with the racial awakening that happened and how we were kind of tracking all the way back to Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Black codes and how those things still exist today. There's a lot when it comes to structural racism that actually plays into this and why it affects Black communities, particularly Black women. We look at rates of high school graduation, we look at rates of unemployment, we look at rates of food insecurity, we look at access to safe spaces to move. We look at referrals. So who gets referral to what kind of care and at what frequency? And so all of those things play a role in why there's a difference. The other thing that I wanted to add, as far as the genetics, is also the way we process food once it enters our body, and the way we're able to metabolize it on the back end. So not everybody who eats, a donut is going to process that donut in the same way. And so thinking about how these environmental factors affect our gut microbiome and how that contributes to weight gain is also something that I think about as well. So it just cannot be a personal accountability argument anymore.
Totally. But I think that what you're getting at, I think that what people are starting to appreciate is how complex it is, right? In some ways, like it is a complex issue that is affected by many different pieces, right? Both structural all the way down to the individual level, right? And so that makes it, especially in our reductionist way in medicine, something that is challenging, I think, for a lot of us to be like, there's so many things to think about, like how do we start? And what is your, I mean, Fatima, what's been your experience with thinking about access issues? I mean, you have a very highly specialized clinic, right? And so how do, and me too, right? Like for a long time, I was basically like the bottleneck at the Brigham with getting into weight man. Like literally, I was like thankfully GMO was there to help a little bit, but like it's ridiculous, right? Like there just aren't
Yeah.
that many of like you or me. So how do you think about that?
Well, first of all, when we think about, and actually there's a study, I think this study needs to be updated, but there was a study that came out around 2010 that looked at who receives a diagnosis of obesity. We already talked about that it disproportionately impacts communities of color, but if you look at Latinx individuals, they're half as likely as white individuals to actually get a diagnosis of obesity. And in terms of Black individuals, only 60% as likely as a white individual to get the diagnosis of obesity. So this goes back to one of the questions you asked previously, which is how does medicalizing it, help? If you don't get the diagnoses, then we'll treat. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but that probably is a proxy for not getting treatment for that disease because the disease isn't listed anywhere. So I think that's one of the issues. In terms of who actually seeks care for weight management, the most common individual in the United States to seek care will be a peri or postmenopausal white woman. That's who typically seeks out care for weight management. Now, you might say, well, why is that? I think what I hear from my patients that fall within that demographic is they're frustrated. They have lots of access to lots of resources. They've tried this diet plan, this exercise plan, this, that, or the other, and are still noticing that they struggle with weight. And so they're like, look, this is beyond my realm. I need help. And then they seek the help out. If we look at Black women, for example, we tend to carry the burden for our entire community. Do we have time to really think, oh gosh, I need to schedule that appointment to go tackle that weight issue that I have, whatever that is? If you don't really see it as something that, maybe impacts everything else you have to get done, in terms of your work or your family commitments, your extended family commitments, et cetera. And so I think that those are some of the differences that we see if we compare and contrast. Now, as a Black woman, I find that, there was one day just last week, I was like, wait a minute, I just saw all Black women the whole day. But I think that people seek me out because they're like, wait a minute, there's a doctor that looks like me. I think that sounds like somebody I would trust. Let me go to her. And so then word spreads within communities. And then you become the person that people want to see, that they feel they can relate to. So I think a lot of it, we know that if we're looking at Black physicians, for example, only about 5% of physicians in this country are Black. And so if people feel more comfortable, if they have this disease of obesity with someone that looks more like me, and there's so few of us, then you can imagine that there would be an issue. You were the bottleneck at the Brigham, and that was for everyone, and so these are key things that I think about as I think about access to us, diagnoses, stressors that may preclude persons that may have obesity from getting the care that they need. And so it's really a challenging situation as we think about it from that perspective.
Right. And the stigma, obviously, that you talked about in terms
Mhm.
of the stigma that is in particular communities around, generally about obesity, obviously, but it's definitely more prevalent in certain communities than others, right? And so it may convince people not to seek care or have them not sort of want to deal with this through the medical system, I guess is sort of what I'm saying. Okay. Yeah. So I think it's helpful, and I was hoping to frame some of this discussion for folks just to understand the challenges sort of within the healthcare system around dealing with some of this. Because again, like it's wonderful that I get to ask you two to come do this, but like you two are very unique people who don't exist everywhere in the world. And so how do you like any brilliant ideas around taking a more like an equity-based, like equity lens to thinking about how to advance obesity, I guess both prevention and treatment, big lofty ideas that are on your minds?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I think, oh, go on, Chioma, you go
Oh,
on.
okay.
No, I will
Yeah.
take over, girl. You better go.
That's
You
all right.
better
That's all
go.
right. Yeah, let it go. Let it go, Chioma. You go.
Uh,
No, you go.
so So for me, when I came from, I was a group fitness instructor for about a decade. And then when I worked in primary care, I just thought I knew. And, the PA profession is very similar to the physician profession. There's only 3 to 4% or identifies African American. That's been stable for a number of years. And so, Rich, it's not, a joke that there really aren't that many people that look like me. And when I started to learn about obesity care and obesity medicine, the thing that struck me the most was access to care. And so that's why I transitioned my primary care clinic, because there are folks that can't go to separate appointments. And it's just, most people see their primary care provider more than they'll see any other provider. So it just made sense to me to open up a space within our clinic, to allow folks to, at least if they can't go anywhere else, at least they can come and get started with us. So that was one. Um, then that allowed me to start to address all of the other factors. So I can do the preventative care. I can do the reproductive health. I can refer to sleep medicine. I can refer for surgery. I can treat all of the other comorbidities. And so it was an optimal environment. The other thing that's nice, and especially with COVID, is that the obesity medicine um, community has always used telemedicine. They've used it for a long, long time. And so it's an easy way to reach people where they are. A lot of patients don't feel comfortable coming to the clinic. And so being able to do a phone call or do a video chat also increased access. And so a lot of my work is just about access.
Fatima, go for it. What are you thinking? What are your big hopes
So
and
I think
dreams?
we just need to modify every human. No, that's just a small thing. So I think the key thing that we don't utilize in obesity in terms of prevention is this idea of fetal programming. And for you guys that are like, what is she talking about? So means that if a mom goes into pregnancy with overweight and obesity, she then exposes the fetus to inflammatory markers, which then sets up and reprograms the genetic target such the child then is born and quickly develops things like type 2 diabetes, what we consider hyperphagia, which means this insatiable desire to eat, things of that sort. So the only way to really target that is to target every woman that potentially has the ability, that has reproductive potential. Now, I'm not just harping on the women. I see quite a few men here. It's important for us to recognize there was a large study that came out actually in England where they looked at the genetic markers on sperm, and they looked at them pre and post-op for people that had undergone what we call bariatric surgery. They saw that the genetic imprinting actually changed 1 year after surgery. Now, we haven't seen that study such that if we look at those children that are born to dads after surgery, that it changes the offspring in terms of their weight status, but we have seen that for women. So there was a large study that came out in this journal called the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism back in 2009. And what we saw was that when you compared children born to mothers and fathers, the same mother and father, before the mom had bariatric surgery and then after, there was a threefold decrease in the prevalence of severe obesity in those children born after. There was a complete improvement in the hormonal profile, metabolic disease in those children born after. And so it shows you that we didn't change anything. The genes are still the same, still the same mom and dad, but we've changed that intrauterine environment from which that child is being developed. So if I could get my dream, that would be changing everyone preconception so we can affect the weight of those that are to come. Now, I know that's a lofty dream, but you asked me what would I like.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. I put it out there. It's great. Wait, so I know that there are questions about, we've mentioned obesity medicine and sort of what obesity care generally. So I think we should spend the rest of our time talking about treatment and treatment, prevention, treatment sort of go together, obviously, within the obesity world. And I also want to do this a little bit through the lens of COVID as well, because that's been, I think it's made it even more challenging in some ways for many people. And so I guess first things first, what's the data? What is the latest on COVID and obesity? How does Chioma, maybe you know something, there's like what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So right now, what we know is that COVID binds the ACE2 receptor, and that is what allows it to enter into the cell. Adipose tissue produces that ACE2 receptor. And so what happens is that once COVID binds the ACE2 receptor, it basically makes it ineffective. So that's why people with obesity are at higher risk for not only having worse outcomes with COVID, but actually dying from COVID. And so that's why obesity is a pro-inflammatory condition. And so when you put COVID, which is a severe inflammatory condition, on top of obesity, which is a pro-inflammatory condition, it's catastrophic. And that's what the data played out. And that's why obesity has been labeled as an independent risk factor for poor outcomes in patients who have COVID. And so we can't not talk about this anymore.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself.
I love it, Chioma. Phenomenal.
Right? She's
excellent. I feel like you've been seeing somebody's obesity COVID lectures. I won't name any names.
I did. I'm learning. I'm just
no, you did. Excellent job.
No, I think it's a really important point to talk about. I mean, obviously, a lot of the conversations we've been having recently have had a COVID lens to it, and we can't not think about things through the lens of COVID these days. And I think obesity is obviously also one of those things that truly there is a direct relationship here. And so, all right, so let's talk a little bit about strategies for sustainably losing weight and actually keeping it off. Because I mean, both of you, I'm sure, have seen, and many people who are here have gone up and down and have gone through that struggle of the yo-yo effect with their weight loss. And so, let's first talk about diet versus physical activity. And I'm not saying which one is more important. What do you guys think? What do you guys talk about most with your patients?
I talk about everything. Have you not met me?
I know you.
I know you do. Everything. I go over everything. My patients tell me I'm intense, but let me tell you, my patients do better than everyone else's. So,
no, but you are intense. That's why I brought you here.
It works. But no, seriously. So I actually don't just focus on one thing. I think that's that's one way we would get short-sighted. I ask them at every single visit about their diet quality, to take me through a typical breakfast, lunch, snack, lunch, dinner, snack. I want to know.
What do you want to see? Like, what do you?
I want to see what they're doing.
I know, but what are you hoping you see?
I'm hoping lean proteins, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables are their predominant source of what they're eating. Right. That's what I want to hear. That's what I want to hear. Now, if they tell me something different, then that's different. But that's what I want to hear. And I hope that they're, I would say that my patients are being truthful, because I can't really help them if I don't know the real deal. With regards to physical activity, the current guidelines are at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. But for patients that have obesity, it's more along the lines of 300 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. And what that means, you guys, if you're trying to find what's moderate intensity, this woman keeps saying all these things. So you should be able to talk during the exercise, but not sing, unless you're like Janet Jackson or something like that. Then you could potentially sing. But typically you should be able to talk, but not sing during the activity. 300 minutes. And she's like, my God, that's a lot. And it doesn't have to be all at once. We do want it in about 10-minute segments to really get the benefit from the cardiovascular activity. So I'm looking at that. I'm asking about their sleep quality and duration. Now, if somebody's telling me they're sleeping for 15 hours, that's not a good thing. It may mean that they need so much sleep because something's, unregulated. Maybe they have an undiagnosed obstructive sleep apnea that needs to be treated. And, I don't play with obstructive sleep apnea, for example. I've lost 2 patients, one that was 11 and one that was 26, from obstructive sleep apnea that was untreated. So I take this very seriously. And I know it also can preclude my weight outcomes, in addition to causing you to die. I mean, it is a nice way to die. You die in your sleep, but I mean, really 11 and 26, come on. I'm asking them at every single visit about their stress. Is it higher than normal? I would say during COVID, most people say it's pretty high, but it may be higher for some versus others. And so I ask them about their stress at every single visit. I ask them about both hunger and satiety. Hunger, I ask them, is how hungry they feel between meals, and satiety, how long it takes them to feel full once they actually start eating. So I'm trying to get a clue of what's happening. And often what I might hear from patients is they say, Doc, I'm doing really great. And then 5 o'clock hits. And then I feel like I can eat what I was, the whole day's worth of food, between 5 p.m. and let's say 10 p.m. They may have intense cravings for certain things that happen based upon what time of day. So I'm really taking all of this information in to glean information about what treatment modalities might be most efficacious for them in light of what they're giving me in terms of that information. So those are the key questions I ask at every single visit. My initial visit is an hour long, so I ask them, maybe 100 times that number of questions, but that gives you a general sense of like a follow-up visit for patients.
For sure. And Shima, what do you say to that? I mean, I think that one of the challenges, right, in primary care in particular, number one, you're dealing with a bunch of other stuff too, generally for people, right? And like maybe you don't have the time that Fatima has sometimes to ask a bunch of those different questions. So how do you do this within a clinic visit? And like, is there certain things that you always hit on, or like there are, other things, or do you let the patient guide it? What's your approach?
Yeah, all of the above. And so I utilize a lot of screening forms. And so I send those forms out ahead of time so I can collect a lot of the information that I need up front. I don't get into specifics about diet. All diets work and all diets fail because people stop dieting. And so I tell folks, your nutrition plan will help you lose weight, but it's the physical activity that'll help you keep it off. The physical activity helps with insulin sensitivity. It also helps with mood and joint mobility and sleep and digestion. And so the physical activity, I don't frame it as for weight loss in and of itself. I frame it as part of a comprehensive plan. On the back, I do regular follow-up visits because no one can do all of this in one setting. And to think that you can just have 1 or 2 sessions with a provider and the issue is resolved takes away the fact that this is a chronic, relapsing, progressive disease. And so regular follow-ups, they're patient-led. And so whatever they want to talk about, that's what we talk about. I use the framework that the Obesity Medicine Association uses. So I always touch on physical activity, nutrition, sleep, and behavioral factors. And so whichever part of that patients want to talk about in any given visit, that's where we go. And then I also will, now I can do the med management as well. And so for folks that are interested in using medications, I start off by saying you're not cheating. If your A1C was 11 and I gave you insulin, that's not cheating. And so I keep that option open. And then I also give the option for surgery. But if folks don't want surgery, I don't push it. And so my visits are very much patient-led. I provide a lot of resources on the background, and then I ask them about those resources. We set SMART goals, so goals that are very specific and measurable and attainable and relevant to their lives, and they're time bound. And so at the next visit, we start off with how they did with their goals, what they want their new goals to be, and what worked and what didn't work.
Sure. How about, Fatima, what about, things like commercial weight loss programs, intermittent fasting? I mean, patients like ask me about this stuff I don't know about you guys, but they ask me about this stuff all the time. And I'm like Jim, I don't subscribe to sort of one dietary approach at all. But how do you point them in any direction with those things if people are looking for more concrete?
No, I actually don't. But I'm going to take a pause, you guys, because I just have found out that Cicely Tyson passed, who was my soror. So I do want to just mentally process that for a second for those of you who may not have known, because it supposedly happened within the last hour. So I just want to pause and acknowledge the wealth of who she is as a human. And then I'll answer your question because I can do both. But I just that literally came on the screen and then you asked the question. When we're thinking about how I help my patients, every single patient that's seen here at MGH at the Weight Center is typically seen by a dietitian, a psychologist, and an obesity medicine physician. So we make up the multidisciplinary team for that patient. When that patient is working with the dietitian at their initial visit, which is 45 minutes in length, and at subsequent visits, 30 minutes in length, they may decide to undergo, I think, what is one of our best programs, which is called Healthy Habits for Life. It's a 12-week program that's run by the dietitians that does not put them on a prescribed diet plan, but then teaches them actually about some of the key tenets about nutrition. the idea of using volumetrics, using foods that are filling, meaning like things that have high water density that will create satiety. Looking at the importance of hydration, things of this sort, things that can really be applied across the life course. We actually just published a paper on this particular program in one of the clinical nutrition journals just at the end of last year that really shows the outcomes that are really positive. And a lot of people really are able to go from that dieting mindset, which I think can be deleterious to one's health, to a mindset where they're actually learning things that they can incorporate into their daily lives and sustain it over the life course. So that's really the approach that I think is most ideal. I'm not a huge fan of throwing you on some shake diet or X diet or Y diet or Z diet. There are some people that do like intermittent fasting. So I have quite a few surgeons that I take care of that feel like it fits with their lifestyle. They're in the operating room most of the day. I don't know what they're doing in COVID, it's another story, but during the non-COVID era, and they find that they're able to just really kind of it fits in their lifestyle where they may be fasting for the first portion of the day, then they don't start eating until really after lunch, which is when they're finished with their time in the or operating room anyway. And so that it just fits their lifestyle, and maybe that causes them to feel good and not feeling the pressure to have to get some intake. Intermittent fasting is an option that people can explore, but most people aren't able to sustain it long term to really get any benefit. We really need to see, 5-10 years duration to see the maximum benefit that you can glean from something like intermittent fasting. So, I take everything, like I said, with a grain of salt. My thing is helping them find something that they can do from a nutrition perspective and sustain over the life course. That's really the key thing that I want from them. I don't want them to crash and do some Whole30 diet, let's just say. If they want to do Whole30 for the rest of their life, that's one thing, but I don't know many people that will. So I think it's important for them to find, what matches what their cultural background is, what their preferences are, and obviously supports that kind of health mantra that we talked about. Lean proteins, whole grains, fruits, vegetables is the predominant source.
For sure. Appreciate that. And Jim, I have to say, like, it's going to be, what is it, like 18 degrees tomorrow, and we're telling people they need to be physically active, and it's COVID and gyms are closed. And like, what have you been, it's great to be able to tell these people that from like within, I tell them from my camera, my virtual clinic, but like concretely, how are we advising people these days, especially around physical activity?
Yeah, and so all movement counts. And so when I would hear people say that they got to the end of Netflix, I would just ask them, like, well, what were you doing? Were you just under a blanket? Or so we would talk about things that they can do in their homes, going up and down the stairs. We have in my house, we call it monkey yoga. And so if we're watching TV, I'll do squats while I'm watching the TV, just normalizing physical activity in the home. I utilize a lot of patient handouts that have body weight activities that people can do. I also encourage people to stretch during the day, to get up from their Zoom meetings for 5 minutes and have just simple mobility exercises. And so there's a lot of free content. There's been some bright spots in COVID. The amount of free fitness content through apps and YouTube and TikTok, it's just phenomenal. And so I help folks curate their social media. And so some of the people they follow actually are the ones that are in their homes, in their living rooms, doing these workouts, trying to find people that they identify with. And so while they're scrolling, they can start to see, okay, well, if you see somebody doing a 2-minute workout, just get up and do it and try it. So I really encourage people to normalize activity all throughout the day. It's hard for a lot of people, especially, single moms that have a lot of, other responsibilities, to carve out an hour to go to a separate place, get a workout in, and then come home and be responsible for dinner and bedtimes. But to be able to get up during the day and do 5 to 10 minute bursts of activity, or we call it exercise snacks. Some people call them exercise snacks. Makes it more accessible, and it can be more intuitive. So I like to use the term joyful movement. So for some folks, it's dancing and just getting them. We do dance breaks in my home. My son he's 3. He watches the Octonauts. It's a underwater cartoon, and some of the characters are vegetables, and they have have dance breaks. And so one of us will yell out dance break, and then we all get up and shake for a little bit, and it all counts.
Totally. And so I'll say, yes, for sure. And the thing that I struggle with most, and I wonder, actually ask both of you how you guys think about this from within the clinic setting, is I was a trainer for a long time before I became a doctor, and am a big believer in the power of strength training and resistance training in particular. And that is not just for people who like the gym. That is for, I mean, and I think especially for weight management, how important that is. And so maybe Fatima, like you can explain a little bit why that's important, right? Like, why is
Well,
it?
I wanted to answer the other question, but I'll do that one too.
Okay, you can do both. But like,
Okay.
why resistance training is so important, and then maybe how you think about advising people to do that even now during COVID, and then for people who are like, I'm not going to some gym to get on some weight machines.
Oh yeah, so I have answers to all of these, but let me go back to her initial question, then I'll answer this one.
Okay, go.
There are quite a few things that I've done during the pandemic to encourage persons to be active. I led with a bariatric surgeon out at Stanford what was called the Social Distancing Fitness Challenge that we led on Twitter in the earlier days of the pandemic. So like, I guess it was March, April. We would get up to 100,000 views for our exercises that we would post. So I would post a high intensity interval exercise. She would post the more yin, namaste, like a yoga flexibility type exercise. And we actually just published on this topic in health promotion practice, physician athletes promoting activity during COVID. And so I'm extremely interested in ensuring that activity is sustained. And I really think, as someone that's worked out at home for many, many years, and I mean, I did join a gym, but going through, my my 5 degrees and my 2 residencies and my 2 fellowships, it was really hard to often find times that fit my schedule to make it to a gym. And so during this era, I accumulated over 300 VHS, and then we made the transition over to DVDs. I have over 700 fitness DVDs in my personal collection. And then we made our transition over to on-demand platforms, which made my life a little bit easier. So now I am a huge fan, and always have been a fan of Beachbody. There are over 1,500 workouts that you get access to for $99 for the entire year, which is like half of my Equinox gym membership per month. I love that. I really encourage, a lot of my patients really enjoy walking as their form of activity. So I send them links to about 10 to 12 Leslie Sansone walking videos that they can do in the comfort of their own home. They don't have to worry about how cold it is. They just turn up the heat a little bit in their home, and they just walk in their living room. It's delightful. And I think there's just so many ways to do this. When I was in residency, I was a huge fan of collagevideo.com, where you could actually go and watch previews for fitness DVDs. And I would have catalogs shipped to the resident clinic so that I could hand to every single patient so that they could go and find something that was appropriate for them. So that dates when I was in residency, but I found, all of these different strategies, ways that, we can really encourage activity. And if you go and look outside of my door right now, you'll see barbells, you'll see free weights, you'll see mini trampoline, you'll see weight benches, you'll see several different types of steps. You see a exercise work bike. I mean, I have all kinds of stuff, but I've accumulated this over the last 25 years. So thankfully, I was like kind of prepped for COVID. I was like, oh, COVID, we're like, I just go inside, I do what I've been doing. I tell patients, especially patients that struggle with weight, I'm not a huge fan of the treadmill for them if they're looking for cardio. A recumbent bike is a really great thing that's very cheap and inexpensive. You can get one from Amazon. The one that I like to recommend is the Marcy recumbent exercise bike on Amazon, which is about $160, much cheaper than a Peloton, which is about $2,500, $3,000, depending upon which model you're looking at. And then you don't have to worry about being hunched up if you're scared about doing kind of a spin-like motion. Now, going back to your second question, which was about why resistance training. When we're looking at our body composition, one of the things you've heard us say is adipose fat, 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 but there's another component that's extremely important, which is lean muscle mass. And as we age, we begin to lose lean muscle mass, and we can develop something called sarcopenia. which is wasting of our muscles. We already know that regardless of how great we are with our training, and if you're, training for the Mr. and Miss Olympia pageant, you still are going to have this decline in lean muscle mass over time. But how do we maintain as much of that as we can? And that's where I see the resistance training piece coming into play. And so I think that it's essential. It's one of those things that you want to balance within your exercise regimen. The American College of Sports Medicine, in conjunction with many other organizations, are strong proponents of adding resistance training and it not being just cardio focused. And for patients that actually struggle with obesity, it can be encouraging because they can often lift more than maybe they could sustain themselves in cardio activity. So it can help you kind of get on the course of getting in a very balanced exercise program. So that's my response.
Love it. I love it. And my other thing is that obviously it's super important for people's metabolic rate too, to have a high muscle mass, and so that's important, and that's why BMI obviously doesn't tell the whole story for people. And so really important also for insulin resistance. Your lean muscle mass is your most important organ for sure. So I'm gonna put my plug in for resistance training there. And then hopefully I just wanted to yeah, I like it. We could sort of round out the conversation by touching on the advanced therapies for weight management. And, Chioma, I'll start with you just in your primary care practice. Like when do you think about putting people on medication for weight management, and how do you just like talk to them about that decision and get their insight or buy into that?
Yeah,
So
no,
from,
yeah, Chioma, you go first.
yeah,
I'll
from
jump in later.
from a primary care perspective, I'm often thinking about multiple diseases at once. And so nowadays, there are so many more tools that we have that will treat two conditions. And so if I have patients that have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, if they have atherosclerosis, if they have hyperlipidemia, I'll think about using the SGLT2 inhibitors because not only are they cardioprotective, but they'll also help folks lose weight. And I think the newer data is starting to show that it helps with the progression of chronic kidney disease. And so that those are medications that I use. For folks that have diabetes, I tend to use the SGLT, the GLP-1 inhibitors. And now there's an oral form of Ozempic. And so for folks that can't do the injection, I'll use the GLP-1s for those folks. For folks that are a little fatigued or are having trouble with concentration, that's where I'll go with more of ephedramine during the day. If they're having trouble with cravings at night, I'll use topiramate kind of later in the day. If they're having trouble with sleep, I'll use topiramate later in the day. So I really try and get at multiple things at once. I'm still learning and I'm still growing.
No, that all sounds great.
I try and think how many, I try and minimize the number of medications that people are using. And so I want to use ones that are going to be most effective for the most number of conditions I can get at.
Totally. And I think the important point that you're just driving home here is, first of all, that there are medications that help people lose weight, right? So these medications are approved for weight loss. And then we also use certain ones off label that also help with weight loss. But also, to your point, like being thoughtful about how can we kill two birds with one stone sometimes, with a lot of these medications maybe started in one world, but we realized that they work well for weight loss, and then we could use them for multiple things. And I'll let Fatima add on to that, but just sort of thinking about resistance that people have to thinking about weight medications as an option for weight loss, and maybe they just don't even know that they even exist, right? I think that's a challenge. Like a lot of patients come to me and they're like, "Oh, I didn't even know that that was a possibility."
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, it's interesting because we're so judicious in use of medications for basically everything else, including eczema, right? Like we start, we got to give them the medication for the eczema. And then when you bring up a medicine for obesity, patients are like, you want to use a medicine I have to take every day? And I'm like, but you're taking those other 6 medicines. I'm confused. I'm so confused. It's just literally like another medicine. And I think this goes back to their own bias against themselves. Chioma talked about this idea of weight bias that we exhibit to individuals with obesity. But I often find that the toughest persons to promote weight bias are the patients themselves. And think about it, the voice they're hearing is that voice in their head all day. They only see me for, maybe once every 4 to 5 months, for 30 minutes. That's that voice for that moment. But the voice they're hearing is the voice in their head. And so it's really about, changing that. When I start medication, I do let them know that if this works, this will be a long-term, lifelong commitment to the use of this medication, because we're impacting often how the brain sees weight. And when we pull back that medicine or pull it off, discontinue it, the weight will return back to where it was prior to the initiation of whatever agent. That idea of a long-term commitment to that drug, if it works, often is also a little bit terrifying for patients, but not terrifying. They've been on their antidepressant for 30 years. But so I'm always just very confused. And I think it's because the way they've thought about obesity is that, oh, it's just something I need to do better for myself. And that, medication is not an option. We use medications. I'm a pediatric and an adult doctor, so we can use medications in children. Several have just gotten recently approved for kids as young as 12 years old. I will use things off label even for those that are younger than that. And so it's important for us to recognize that it's important. It's also important that we haven't gotten into the surgical consideration, which I think
Yeah.
is.
When do you refer people to surgery? Like, what's that
Mhm.
sort of decision point for you?
Yeah, this is the way I really explain it. And so I'm going to let you guys borrow this. So it's about using the right tool for the size of the problem. So, we're in Boston. I think there's snow that's going on outside. It should be dropped to 7 degrees tonight, I think. And I always ask my patients, I said, since we're based in Boston, so, if we got it, let's say 12 inches of snow, which that's child's play here in Boston, what would be the appropriate tool for me to use to remove the snow? And they often will give me a reasonable answer. Oh, let's get a plow. I was like, yeah, that's pretty good. We kind of move the snow out the way so we can continue about our daily lives. And so then I asked them, what's the problem with me using like a teaspoon? Can't that also move the snow? And they look at me like I'm ridiculous. And I'm like, but I could just go and, use a teaspoon and go scoop up the snow, but it's not the right tool for the size of the problem. When we're looking at metabolic and bariatric surgery, it's using the right tool for the size of the problem. Those that have severe obesity or those that have moderate obesity with some really significant obesity associated complications, such as sleep apnea or type 2 diabetes or heart disease, for example. And I believe in using bariatric surgery across the age spectrum. So I believe use it in kids. I have many kids that I send to surgery that do extremely well. And actually kids, I would say, do even better than adults because if they have diabetes or if they have sleep apnea, they've only had it for a small amount of time because they're still kids, right? When I'm sending a 70-year-old to surgery, they've had a much longer history of those diseases associated with their obesity. So the likelihood of resolution is lower, still good, but not as good as that, 14-year-old that I'm sending that may have had some diagnoses for the last 2 or 3 years. And so that's really kind of how I think about it, using the right tool for the size of the problem. I wouldn't use a teaspoon approach to move, snow and use that as my tool to get snow out of the way in Boston down the Mass Pike. Can you imagine me going down and let me get my little teaspoon out? I need a plow. And so it's using the right tool for the size of the problem.
Totally. Well, I'm really, grateful for both of you for coming out tonight and sharing your wisdom with this group. I think that one of the hopes, and I think we did do this, is like really making sure people understand that obesity is a disease, right? There's so many different factors that contribute to it, including our hormones and our genetics and things that we don't have direct control over, right? We do have we do have control over some of the lifestyle elements that certainly go into modifying the disease, preventing it for sure. And like, I think all three of us would agree that even if we do put people on medications or send them to surgery, it is still those fundamental lifestyle changes that are going to make their weight loss sustainable for the long term, right? So I always try to make sure that that's clear, because I think that sometimes the risk of having a medical approach is that people think that the medical system can take care of all of it, and that's especially not the case with obesity. But I think we did, hopefully, people come away from this conversation with understanding like, oh, this is actually like quite complex. And this is not just a matter of like, I did something wrong or like, something like that. And so also knowing that the two of you exist, right. And that there are obesity medicine specialists out there in the world. And, fortunate that we live here in Boston where, medical specialists abound. And so, encourage people who want to take a medical approach to this and like think about it as holistically as possible to know that both of you exist. Obviously I exist and this is what I do too, but yeah, just really, really grateful to both of you for taking time out of your busy lives to share it with people who are in our own backyard and may not know that, you guys exist down the road. So thank you.
It was great to see you all. Thank you so much, Rich,
Absolutely.
for having me. I
Yeah,
really
my
appreciate
pleasure.
it. And Dr. Stanford.
I love your language, my dear Chioma. It's been a delight.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all for joining tonight. I really appreciate it. All right.
Absolutely. You guys have a good time.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Take
Okay,
care.
bye.
Stay safe.
Take care.